Imagine a government program that gave LSD to unsuspecting citizens, that hired prostitutes to drug random men in secret apartments, that experimented on prisoners, mental patients, and its own employees, that destroyed most of its records to hide the truth. You don't have to imagine it. It happened. For over a decade, from 1953 to 1964, the Central Intelligence Agency conducted one of the most extensive and disturbing programs of human experimentation in American history. They called it MKUltra. This is the story of how America's intelligence agency, in the name of national security, crossed every ethical line, violated the trust of its own citizens, and created a legacy of trauma that echoes to this day. This is the story of scientific hubris, Cold War paranoia, and the men who believed that the ends justified any means. What you're about to hear is not conspiracy theory. Every word is documented in declassified files that the CIA tried to destroy, testimony given under oath before Congress, and the shattered lives of those who survived. To understand MKUltra, you must first understand the terror that gripped America in the early 1950s. The Korean War had just ended, and something deeply unsettling was happening. American prisoners of war were returning home, but some of them seemed different, changed. In newsreel footage and military debriefings, they spoke in flat, mechanical voices. They denounced their own country. They confessed to war crimes they hadn't committed. They praised communism with an eerie conviction that seemed rehearsed, programmed. The term that terrified America's intelligence community was brainwashing, literally translated from the Chinese "qinao," meaning wash brain. The Soviets and Chinese American officials believed had discovered something, a way to break down the human mind and rebuild it according to their design. If this was true, if enemy powers could turn loyal American soldiers into programmed automatons, then the implications were catastrophic. What if communist agents could infiltrate the highest levels of government? What if they could create assassins who had no memory of their programming? What if the next war would be fought not with bombs, but with drugs, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation? Cardinal Józef Mindszenty's trial in Hungary in 1949 had shown the world what confessions could be extracted through mysterious means. The cardinal, a pillar of anti-communist resistance, had stood before cameras and admitted to crimes of treason and espionage. His voice was hollow, his eyes were vacant. Something had been done to him. In this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, the CIA faced a terrible calculus: either develop these capabilities themselves or risk falling behind in what intelligence officials called the battle for men's minds. In 1952, a CIA memorandum warned, "We are forced to consider the possible use of chemical agents which might aid us in the interrogation of enemy agents." The memo continued with chilling candor. "We should give thought to the moral implications of such activities, but our ultimate concern is the development of methods which would allow us to prevent the loss of intelligence or create vulnerabilities in enemy personnel." The translation was simple: the ends justify the means. By 1953, the CIA had made its decision. They would not just study these techniques, they would master them. They would experiment, test, refine, and perfect methods of controlling human behavior, and they would do it in absolute secrecy. The justification was always the same: national security, protection against communist mind control, keeping America safe. But as we will see, what began as a defensive program quickly became something far more sinister. The stage was set for MKUltra. On this date, CIA Director Allen Dulles approved a new program. The cryptonym was MKUltra. The stated purpose was research into behavioral modification, a sterile term for what the CIA really wanted: the ability to control the human mind. The man chosen to lead this program was Sidney Gottlieb, a brilliant chemist with a clubfoot and a stutter, who would later be called the CIA's poisoner-in-chief and Dr. Death. Gottlieb was a contradiction, a folk dancer who grew Christmas trees on his farm in Virginia, yet a man willing to test the most dangerous drugs on unsuspecting human beings. Under Gottlieb's direction, MKUltra would grow into a sprawling web of 149 sub-projects involving at least 80 institutions, 44 universities, 15 research foundations or pharmaceutical companies, 12 hospitals, and 3 prisons. Most of these institutions had no idea they were working for the CIA. The declassified documents reveal the staggering breadth of MKUltra's goals. This wasn't just about truth serum. The CIA wanted to develop drugs that could promote illogical thinking and make victims appear drunk, create substances that would render the induction of hypnosis easier, enhance the ability to withstand torture and interrogation, produce amnesia for events before and during interrogation, produce shock and confusion over extended periods, lower ambition and general working efficiency, promote weakness or distortion of the eyesight or hearing faculties, knock people unconscious with substances delivered through the air or in food, create physical disablement such as paralysis. One memo, cold and clinical, outlined the search for materials that could discredit an individual through behavioral changes or create pure euphoria with no subsequent letdown. Another sought compounds that would alter personality structure in such a way that the tendency of the recipient to become dependent upon another person is enhanced. This was the CIA's wish list, to remake human consciousness itself. Between 1953 and 1964, the CIA funneled millions of dollars into MKUltra. The exact amount remains classified, but what we know is troubling enough. The budget documents show a labyrinth of funding mechanisms designed to hide the CIA's involvement. Money was laundered through foundations with innocent-sounding names: the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, the Geschichte Fund for Medical Research. These were cutouts, intermediaries that made CIA money appear to be private philanthropy. One particularly disturbing transaction involved $375,000 donated to a private medical institution for a building fund. The donation was made through an intermediary to appear as private philanthropy. This triggered matching federal construction grants. The institution never knew the money came from the CIA. In total, over $1 million in federal hospital construction funds, intended for public health, were diverted to create facilities where the CIA would have access to experimental subjects. The then CIA General Counsel wrote a legal opinion supporting this deception, arguing it was justified as long as the CIA derived adequate benefit. It was approved at the highest levels of the agency. This is how MKUltra operated, through deception, through institutional capture, through the corruption of scientific research itself. The umbrella opens. By 1954, MKUltra was fully operational. Under its umbrella, the CIA funded research into LSD and other hallucinogens, the primary focus, hypnosis and combinations of hypnosis with drugs, sensory deprivation and isolation, electroshock therapy, harassment techniques, paramilitary devices and materials, the use of alcohol, the use of various stimulants and depressants, materials that would cause brain concussion, and most disturbing of all, testing on unwitting subjects. Admiral Stansfield Turner, CIA director in 1977, would later testify before Congress. The deputy director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program, which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. The word unwitting is key. These were people who had no idea they were being used as guinea pigs. They did not consent. They were not informed. They were simply used. A 1963 CIA Inspector General report noted with clinical detachment that the concepts involved in manipulating human behavior are found by many people both within and outside the agency to be distasteful and unethical. The report then concluded that the research should continue. The machine was running, and it was about to destroy lives. Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD-25, became the crown jewel of MKUltra. The CIA believed it might be the key to unlocking human consciousness, to breaking down psychological defenses, to creating the perfect truth serum. The drug had been synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. Its mind-altering effects were discovered by accident in 1943 when Hofmann absorbed a small amount through his skin and experienced what he later called a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition. By the early 1950s, Some psychiatrists were using LSD experimentally in therapy. The CIA saw different potential. In doses of just 100 micrograms, less than a grain of sand, LSD could shatter a person's sense of reality. Time became meaningless. The boundary between self and world dissolved. Colors sang, walls breathed. Terror and ecstasy became indistinguishable. What if this drug could be weaponized? What if it could be slipped into an enemy agent's drink, rendering him suggestible, confused, willing to reveal secrets? What if it could create artificial psychosis, allowing the CIA to study mental breakdown without the complications of genuine insanity? The declassified documents reveal a systematic program of LSD testing that expanded in waves. First, the CIA tested LSD on themselves. Sidney Gottlieb and his colleagues took the drug to understand its effects. These sessions, held in safe houses and CIA facilities, were wild affairs. Intelligence officers tripping together, observing each other, taking notes on the dissolution of their own minds. But self-experimentation had limits. The CIA needed data on unsuspecting subjects. They needed to see what happened when LSD was given without warning, without context, without support. Second wave, military volunteers. The Army conducted LSD experiments at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and Edgewood Arsenal. Soldiers were told they would be testing new uniforms or equipment. Instead, they were dosed with LSD and observed. Some experiments involved mixing LSD with other chemicals to see how they interacted. Some subjects were given LSD repeatedly over weeks or months. Third wave, the vulnerable populations. This is where MKUltra crossed from unethical to monstrous. Prisoners as guinea pigs. At the Federal Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Harris Isbell conducted some of MKUltra's most disturbing experiments. The subjects were drug addicts, vulnerable men, often African American, trapped in a federal institution with no power to refuse. Dr. Isbell's method was simple and cruel. He offered addicts a choice. They could participate in LSD experiments and receive heroin as payment, or they could endure withdrawal. For men in the grip of addiction, this was no choice at all. The experiments were extreme. Some subjects were given LSD for 77 consecutive days. Others received doses 40 times stronger than the threshold level. Dr. Isbell was searching for the edge of human tolerance, and his subjects paid the price with their sanity. In his secret correspondence with the CIA, codenamed under the cryptonym of his CIA handler, Dr. Isbell reported his findings with scientific detachment, but his subjects lived through hell, extended psychotic episodes, terrifying hallucinations, psychological breaks that left permanent scars. The ethical violations are staggering. These were men who could not freely consent. They were addicted, institutionalized, and desperate. They were offered drugs as payment to take other drugs, and they were never told who was really behind the experiments: psychiatric patients. At multiple hospitals across America, psychiatric patients became unwitting test subjects. One facility, which received CIA building funds, provided access to patients for experimentation. These were people at their most vulnerable, suffering from mental illness, trusting their doctors, believing they were receiving treatment. Instead, they were research subjects. LSD was administered without their knowledge. Their reactions were observed and documented. When they had psychotic breaks or terrifying experiences, it was all recorded as data. In one documented case at a state hospital, experiments were conducted on criminal sexual psychopaths. These men, already stigmatized and confined, were given powerful psychoactive drugs to study behavioral modification. The results were never used to help them. They existed merely to satisfy the CIA's research needs. Perhaps most troubling was the CIA's infiltration of American academia. Through front organizations and grants that appeared to be legitimate research funding, MKUltra money flowed into prestigious universities. At Stanford University, at Columbia, at the University of Rochester, at numerous other institutions, researchers conducted studies that were actually part of MKUltra, and many of them didn't know it. The CIA concealed its sponsorship. Scientists who thought they were conducting basic research on human cognition or psychotherapy were actually feeding data into the CIA's behavioral control program. This corruption of science is one of MKUltra's most insidious legacies. Researchers unknowingly became part of an intelligence operation. Their scientific work was tainted. Their data was used for purposes they never intended. And when the truth emerged, it cast a shadow over legitimate research that persists to this day. LSD was the centerpiece, but MKUltra's methods were diverse and disturbing. Hypnosis. 8 sub-projects explored whether hypnosis could enhance interrogation, create amnesia, or even program subjects to perform actions against their will. 2 projects combined hypnosis with drugs, seeking to create deeply suggestible states. Electroshock. Experiments tested whether electric current applied to the brain could erase memories or make subjects more compliant. The goal was to create targeted amnesia to make people forget what they knew or what had been done to them. Sensory deprivation. Subjects were placed in isolation chambers deprived of sight, sound, and touch. The CIA wanted to know how long it took for the human mind to break under these conditions. Some subjects emerged from isolation with lasting psychological damage. Verbal and physical harassment. Documented techniques included extended interrogation, sleep deprivation, and psychological abuse designed to break down resistance. The 1963 Inspector General report noted coolly that many of these techniques were distasteful and unethical, but recommended the research continue because we are less advanced than the Soviets. This was the rationale that sustained MKUltra. Whatever we do, they're doing worse. We must keep up, we must go further. We must sacrifice ethics for security. But as we'll see, this logic led to tragedy. If MKUltra sounds like something from a spy thriller, Operation Midnight Climax sounds like something from pornography. But it was real. It happened. And it represents one of the most brazenly unethical operations in CIA history. The location, San Francisco, 1955. The address, 225 Chestnut Street, a Russian Hill apartment with a sweeping view of the bay. Inside, the decor was pure bordello, red velvet curtains, erotic artwork, a bed with satin sheets. Behind a mirror on the wall, invisible observers watched and recorded everything that happened. This was a CIA safe house, and what happened there was drug testing disguised as vice. The man who ran Operation Midnight Climax was George Hunter White, a hard-drinking former Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent who had joined the CIA's quest for behavioral control. White was a character from noir fiction, tough, cynical, and morally flexible. In his personal journal, he later wrote, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun." The CIA gave White a simple mission: test LSD on unwitting subjects in realistic scenarios. See if it could make people reveal secrets. See if it could make them suggestible. See if it could create exploitable vulnerabilities. White's solution was brilliant in its sleaziness. He would create a honey trap. He would use sex workers to lure men to the safe house. He would drug them without their knowledge. And he would watch what happened. How it worked. The operation was sophisticated. White recruited prostitutes from the San Francisco area and put them on the CIA payroll. Their job was simple: pick up men in bars, restaurants, and on the street, and bring them back to the apartment on Chestnut Street. The women were skilled at their work. They targeted single men, married men, businessmen, tourists, anyone who could be enticed. Once at the apartment, the women would prepare drinks. The drinks were spiked with LSD. Then the CIA agents would watch. Behind the two-way mirror, George White and his colleagues observed as the drugs took effect. They watched men become confused, paranoid, euphoric, terrified. They watched sexual encounters take place under the influence of powerful hallucinogens. They took notes. White, sitting in his observation post, would sometimes drink martinis while watching. He called it Operation Midnight Climax, with a mixture of cynicism and dark humor. The men who walked through that door had no idea what was happening to them. They thought they were having a paid sexual encounter. Instead, they were being drugged and observed as part of a government experiment. Imagine the experience. You meet an attractive woman. You go back to her apartment. You have a drink. Then reality begins to fracture. The walls start breathing. Colors become impossibly vivid. Your sense of self dissolves. You experience terror, confusion, perhaps paranoia. You don't know why this is happening. You don't know if you're going insane. Hours later, you come down. You're disoriented, exhausted, possibly traumatized. The woman is gone. You stumble home. You never speak of it to anyone because you don't understand what happened. You might wonder for the rest of your life if you had a psychotic break or a bad reaction to alcohol. You never learn that your own government drugged you. You never learn that men behind a mirror watched your most vulnerable moments. You never learn that your experience was recorded in CIA files as Experiment No. 47 or Subject No. 89. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't limited to San Francisco. The CIA ran similar safe houses in New York City. At least 3 individuals were identified as running these operations, though their identities are protected under the Privacy Act. The New York operation may have been even larger. More apartments, more prostitutes, more unwitting victims. The documents are fragmentary, but they suggest a nationwide network of drug testing facilities disguised as brothels. The scale is staggering. Over the years that Midnight Climax operated, from 1954 to 1963, hundreds, possibly thousands, of men were drugged without their knowledge. None of them could consent. None of them could refuse. None of them knew their government was experimenting on them. The justification. How did the CIA justify this? In the documents, the reasoning is coldly pragmatic. Laboratory conditions are too artificial. To understand how LSD affects people in real-world situations, you need real-world testing. And what better test than a sexual encounter, a situation involving intimacy, vulnerability, and lowered defenses? A 1963 CIA Inspector General report concluded that Midnight Climax had little scientific merit. The agents doing the observation were not trained researchers. The dosages were inconsistent. The subjects were impossible to follow up with. The data was, in scientific terms, nearly worthless. But the operation continued for nearly a decade. Why? Perhaps because it was fun, George White's own words. Perhaps because once started, the bureaucratic momentum was impossible to stop. Perhaps because admitting it was worthless would mean admitting it had been unethical from the beginning. The Reckoning. Operation Midnight Climax was finally shut down in 1963, not because of ethical concerns, but because a CIA Inspector General's report suggested it posed security risks. The safe houses were too visible. The prostitutes might talk. The risk of exposure was too high. The subjects of these experiments were never notified, never debriefed, never offered medical or psychological support. They disappeared back into their lives, carrying whatever psychological scars the experience left. To this day, we don't know who they all were. The CIA kept no list of names. George White's observation notes were destroyed, along with most MKUltra records in 1973. The victims are anonymous, scattered across America, most likely unaware to this day that they were part of one of history's most unethical experiments. Operation Midnight Climax stands as a monument to institutional hubris, the belief that in the name of national security, any violation of human dignity is permissible. It strips away any pretense that MKUltra was about defensive research or protecting Americans. This was exploitation, pure and simple, dressed up in the language of intelligence gathering, and it was just one of 149 sub-projects. November 28, 1953, 2:30 a.m. A man crashes through the closed window of room 1018A at the Hotel Statler in New York City. He falls 13 floors to his death on the sidewalk below. The man is Frank Olson, a 43-year-old biochemist working for the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. The official story: suicide while suffering from depression. The family is told Frank had been troubled, mentally unstable, that he jumped. The truth, hidden for 22 years, is far darker. 9 days earlier. On November 18, 1953, Frank Olson attended a retreat at Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland. It was presented as a working meeting for Army and CIA personnel involved in biological warfare research. Olson was there with his boss, Vincent Ruitt, and several others. On the second night after dinner, Sidney Gottlieb served liqueur. It was spiked with LSD. The guests were not told. This was one of Gottlieb's experiments, dosing his own colleagues to study their reactions. It was reckless, unprofessional, and profoundly unethical. But in the world of MKUltra, where rules were routinely broken, it seemed acceptable. 20 minutes later, Gottlieb revealed what he had done. Some of the men laughed, some were angry. Frank Olson became very quiet. Over the next few days, Frank Olson began to fall apart. He became deeply anxious, agitated, convinced something was terribly wrong. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't focus. He told colleagues he had made a terrible mistake and needed to quit his job. Ruet and Gottlieb grew concerned. This wasn't the mild confusion they'd observed in other experiments. Olson was having what appeared to be a psychotic break. They decided he needed psychiatric help. On November 24th, Olson was taken to New York to see Dr. Harold Abramson, a physician who was himself part of MKUltra, studying LSD for the CIA. Dr. Abramson prescribed bourbon and Nembutal, a depressant, for a man already in psychological crisis. It was medical malpractice at best. The next day, Olson was somewhat calmer. Dr. Abramson concluded he should be hospitalized for observation. Plans were made to take him to Chestnut Lodge, a psychiatric facility in Maryland, the following day. That night, Frank Olson was staying in room 1018A at the Hotel Statler. His CIA escort, Robert Lashbrook, was in the other bed. Around 2:30 a.m., Lashbrook heard glass breaking. He turned on the light. Frank Olson was gone. The window blinds were drawn, but the window behind them was shattered. Lashbrook's first phone call was not to the police or an ambulance. It was to Sidney Gottlieb. "Well, he's gone," Lashbrook said. Gottlieb immediately grasped the meaning. Frank Olson's death was quickly ruled a suicide. His family was told he had been depressed and had jumped from the window. They were not told about the LSD. They were not told about MKUltra. They were told nothing. For 22 years, the Olson family lived with the official story. Frank had been mentally ill. He had killed himself. It was a private tragedy, unexplained and inexplicable. Then, in 1975, the Rockefeller Commission's investigation into CIA abuses uncovered a single line in a document. One person died in 1953, apparently as a result of unwitting LSD administration. The Army quietly confirmed the person was Frank Olson. The revelation was devastating. The Olson family learned that Frank hadn't been mentally ill. He'd been drugged by his own government. His depression was drug-induced psychosis. His death might not have been suicide at all. President Gerald Ford personally apologized to the Olson family. Congress appropriated $750,000 as compensation. The CIA expressed regret. But the family's questions remained unanswered. In 1994, Frank Olson's body was exhumed for forensic examination. The findings were disturbing. The injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. There was a skull fracture suggesting blunt force trauma before the fall. Forensic experts concluded Olson had likely been struck on the head and then thrown from the window. Was Frank Olson murdered? The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. He had expressed doubts about the biological weapons program. He had witnessed disturbing experiments. He was becoming unstable and unpredictable. In the paranoid world of Cold War intelligence, was he seen as a security risk? We may never know the complete truth. Robert Lashbrook, the man in the room when Olson died, claimed to be asleep. Sidney Gottlieb, who authorized the LSD dosing, took his secrets to the grave. The CIA maintains Olson's death was a tragic accident, nothing more. But even if we accept the official story that Olson jumped in a moment of drug-induced psychosis, the moral culpability is clear. Sidney Gottlieb drugged a man without his consent, triggering a psychological breakdown that ended in death. The CIA then covered it up for 22 years. This wasn't an unfortunate accident. It was negligent homicide at minimum, covered up by institutional deception. Frank Olson is the only known death directly attributed to MKUltra, but he is far from the only victim. The declassified documents and congressional testimony reveal a trail of damaged lives. Harold Blauer, a professional tennis player suffering from depression, Blauer was admitted to the New York State Psychiatric Institute in 1952. Without his knowledge, he was given experimental injections of mescaline as part of an Army Chemical Corps project related to MKUltra. After the fifth injection, Blauer became violently ill, suffered convulsions, and died. His family was told he had died from an adverse reaction to medication, but not that he had been an unwitting test subject. The addicts of Lexington. We may never know the full toll of Dr. Harris Isbell's experiments at the Lexington Narcotics Hospital. Men were given massive doses of LSD for extended periods. Some experienced psychotic breaks. Some had lasting psychological damage. Their names are lost in destroyed records. They were poor, black, addicted. People society had already discarded. Nobody counted their suffering. The prisoners. At least 3 penal institutions were used for MKUltra experiments. Prisoners were ideal subjects. They were captive, powerless, and nobody would miss them if something went wrong. Some were told they were receiving medical treatment. Others were simply experimented on without any explanation. The psychological and physical toll is unknown. The mental patients. At hospitals across America, psychiatric patients became test subjects. People who came seeking help for mental illness were instead given experimental drugs, subjected to extreme treatments, used as raw material for research. Their trust in medical care was violated. Some never recovered. The men of midnight climax. Scattered across America are men who decades ago had experiences they couldn't explain. Terrifying hallucinations, paranoid episodes, psychological breaks that seemed to come from nowhere. They lived with these memories, never knowing they had been drugged by their own government. Some may have been diagnosed with mental illness. Some may have been hospitalized. Some may have committed suicide, believing they were going insane. We will never know their names or count their number. Admiral Stansfield Turner testified in 1977, "It is totally abhorrent to me to think of using a human being as a guinea pig and in any way jeopardizing his life and his health, no matter how great the cause." But the damage was done. MKUltra didn't just destroy individual lives. It corrupted institutions, tainted scientific research, and violated the fundamental principle that government exists to protect its citizens, not experiment on them. The victims of MKUltra never volunteered. They never consented. They were simply used and discarded. And when the program was finally exposed, most of them never even knew they had been victims. This is the human cost of MKUltra, measured not just in one death, but in countless shattered lives, in trust betrayed, in the fundamental violation of human dignity in the name of national security. January 1973. Richard Helms is about to step down as Director of Central Intelligence. Before he leaves office, he issues an order to Sidney Gottlieb, his successor at the Office of Technical Services, destroy all MKUltra records. The reason given is routine housekeeping. The files are old, no longer operationally relevant, but the timing suggests otherwise. The Watergate scandal is exploding. Congressional oversight of intelligence agencies is intensifying. The CIA is under scrutiny like never before. The order is carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. Boxes of documents are pulled from files. Thousands of pages detailing experiments, subject reactions, institutional connections, financial records, the entire documentary history of a decade of human experimentation are fed into shredders or burned. By the time the destruction is complete, MKUltra has been erased from official CIA records, or so they believe. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published an explosive article in the New York Times revealing that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic spying operations. The article mentioned, almost in passing, that the CIA had also conducted drug experiments on unwitting Americans. This brief reference triggered a cascade of investigations. President Gerald Ford established the Rockefeller Commission to investigate CIA abuses. Congress launched its own inquiries through the Church Committee in the Senate and the Pike Committee in the House. As investigators began digging, they encountered a wall of missing records. When they asked about drug experiments, CIA officials provided limited documentation, mostly an Inspector General report from 1963 that outlined the program in general terms but lacked specifics. "Where are the detailed files?" investigators asked. "Destroyed," CIA officials replied. "On whose order?" "Richard Helms." "Why?" "Routine." The investigators were persistent. They found fragments, financial records that had escaped destruction, because they were filed separately, testimony from former employees, scattered references in other documents. Slowly, a picture emerged. Senator Frank Church's Select Committee on Intelligence held hearings throughout 1975. The testimony revealed shocking details. Admiral Stansfield Turner, the new CIA director appointed by President Carter, testified about a program that included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans, and foreign. The committee learned about safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where prostitutes lured men who were then drugged and observed. They learned about experiments on prisoners and mental patients. They learned about LSD administered without consent, sometimes with tragic consequences. Most dramatically, they learned about Frank Olson. The biochemist's death, hidden for 22 years as a suicide, was revealed to be the result of CIA drug experimentation. President Ford publicly apologized to the Olson family, but the committee's investigation was hamstrung by the missing records. They could establish that MKUltra existed. They could document some of its activities, but they couldn't identify most of the victims, couldn't fully trace the money, couldn't determine the complete scope of the program. Senator Church himself said, "The Central Intelligence Agency drugged American citizens without their knowledge or consent. It used university facilities and personnel without their knowledge. It funded leading researchers, often without their knowledge." Senator Edward Kennedy, whose subcommittee on health also investigated, was more direct. "The intelligence community of this nation, which requires a shroud of secrecy in order to operate, has a very sacred trust from the American people. The CIA's program of human experimentation of the 50s and 60s violated that trust. It was violated again on the day the bulk of the agency's records were destroyed in 1973. By the end of 1975, the public knew about MKUltra, but the picture was fragmentary. The destroyed records meant that most victims could never be identified. The full scope of institutional involvement remained unknown. The effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the experiments couldn't be determined. Legal accountability was nearly impossible. CIA officials testified that they couldn't remember details. Richard Helms, questioned about why he ordered the destruction, claimed it was simply routine records disposal. Sidney Gottlieb, called before Congress, invoked his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. The cover-up had largely succeeded. The truth had emerged, but in such truncated form that full accountability was impossible. The Freedom of Information breakthrough. Then, in March 1977, something unexpected happened. A persistent Freedom of Information Act requester asked the CIA to search all of its retired records, not just the obvious files. A CIA employee named Frank Lorbinger took the request seriously. Lorbinger went to the Retired Records Center and did something previous searchers hadn't done. He looked in the budget and fiscal section files. There, misfiled and forgotten, were 7 boxes of financial records related to MKUltra. These were the documents that should have been destroyed in 1973, but had escaped because they were in the wrong place. They contained vouchers, funding approvals, contract details, and crucially, the names of 185 researchers and 80 institutions involved in MKUltra. When Admiral Turner learned of this discovery in July 1977, he immediately notified Congress. New hearings were scheduled. On August 3, 1977, Turner testified before a joint session of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Subcommittee on Health. The scale was larger than previously known, 149 sub-projects, not the 144 previously estimated. The number of institutions involved had more than doubled. The geographic spread was nationwide. New victims were identified. Experiments on criminal sexual psychopaths at state hospitals. Extensive testing at the Lexington Narcotics Facility, far beyond what was previously known. Multiple safe house operations in different cities. The financial corruption was worse than suspected. The $375,000 building contribution that had triggered matching federal funds, making the government unwittingly fund its own secret experiments. But even these new documents were incomplete. They were financial records. Who got paid how much for what general purpose? The detailed scientific records, the subject files, the outcome data, all of that had been destroyed in 1973. Despite the revelations, no one was prosecuted. Richard Helms was never charged with obstruction of justice for ordering the destruction of records. Sidney Gottlieb faced no criminal charges for administering drugs to unwitting subjects. The CIA employees who ran Operation Midnight Climax were not prosecuted for what amounted to assault. The reason? Legal complexities, statute of limitations, difficulty proving criminal intent, and most of all, the destroyed evidence. Without the detailed records, prosecutors couldn't build cases that would stand up in court. The victims, scattered and mostly unidentified, couldn't sue because they didn't know they were victims. The few who did know, like the Olsen family, received settlements that required them to sign away their rights to further legal action. The institutions that had unknowingly participated were never officially notified. Universities, hospitals, research foundations, they were left to discover through news reports that they had been used by the CIA. The agency, citing the Privacy Act, refused to publicly name them. Throughout the investigations, a pattern emerged. CIA officials claimed ignorance, faulty memory, or bureaucratic confusion. Documents were lost or misfiled or destroyed in routine housekeeping. When pressed on why the MKUltra records were destroyed in 1973, just as investigations were beginning, officials maintained it was coincidental. When asked why new documents kept appearing years after supposedly exhaustive searches, they cited the complexity of their filing system. Admiral Turner, to his credit, seemed genuinely appalled by what he learned. He told Congress, "It is totally abhorrent to me to think of using a human being as a guinea pig and in any way jeopardizing his life and his health, no matter how great the cause." But Turner was cleaning up a mess made by his predecessors. The men who created MKUltra, who expanded it, who destroyed the evidence, they faced no real consequences. Because of the destruction order, there are questions that will never be answered. How many people were subjected to unwitting drug tests? The CIA estimates thousands, but the true number is unknown. Who were they? A handful of names are known, but most victims remain anonymous. What happened to them? Did they suffer lasting psychological damage? Did some die? We'll never have a complete accounting. Which universities and hospitals were involved? The CIA knows from the recovered financial records, but citing privacy concerns, refuses to publicly name all of them. What did the CIA learn? Were the experiments scientifically valuable, or were they merely sadistic exercises dressed up as research? The data was destroyed. The 1973 destruction order remains one of the most effective cover-ups in American history. It transformed MKUltra from a documented program with identifiable victims and clear institutional accountability into a half-known nightmare, a scandal that everyone knows happened but whose full dimensions remain forever hidden. MKUltra occupies a unique place in American conspiracy culture. Unlike most conspiracy theories, MKUltra is not a theory at all. It's a documented fact. The CIA really did conduct these experiments. They really did drug unwitting citizens. They really did try to cover it up. But this confirmed conspiracy has become a foundation for countless unconfirmed theories. If the CIA did this, what else might they have done? If they lied about MKUltra for decades, what else are they lying about? The most persistent theories link MKUltra to political assassinations. The logic is seductive. If the CIA was trying to create programmed assassins, and if political figures died under mysterious circumstances, perhaps the two are connected. The Sirhan question. In 1968, Sirhan assassinated Robert F. Kennedy. At his trial, Sirhan claimed to have no memory of the shooting. He had written bizarre, repetitive entries in his diary. Some researchers noted that these symptoms were consistent with hypnotic programming. Sirhan's defense team brought in experts who testified that he appeared to be in a dissociative state. His claim of amnesia was genuine. Had he been programmed? The theory has been investigated multiple times. No credible evidence of CIA involvement has ever been found, but the questions persist. The RFK case. Robert Kennedy was a vocal critic of the CIA and had vowed to investigate his brother's assassination if elected president. His murder, some argue, was too convenient. Theories proliferate about multiple shooters, about Sirhan being a patsy, about MK creating the perfect fall guy. These theories remain unproven, but they won't die because MK proved the CIA was capable of attempting such things. The Manchurian Candidate, Richard Condon's 1959 novel, The Manchurian Candidate, depicted a brainwashed assassin programmed by communist agents. The book became a bestseller and a film. Many believe Condon knew about MK and was writing veiled truth. In fact, the CIA was trying to create exactly what Condon described, a programmed assassin who would kill on command and remember nothing afterward. They never succeeded. The human mind proved more resilient than they anticipated. But they tried. And that attempt is now part of history. One MK connection that is documented involves Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. From 1959 to 1962, while Kaczynski was an undergraduate at Harvard, he participated in a psychological experiment conducted by Professor Henry Murray. Murray's experiment, which involved subjecting students to brutal psychological attacks designed to break down their ego and beliefs, was part of MK. Murray was studying personality and stress response, funded by CIA money that Harvard didn't know came from the intelligence agency. Kaczynski, a brilliant but socially isolated 16-year-old mathematical prodigy, was subjected to intensive interrogations where his deeply held beliefs were viciously attacked. The sessions were designed to create maximum psychological stress. Years later, Kaczynski became the Unabomber, a domestic terrorist who killed 3 people and injured 23 others in a campaign against technology and modern society. His manifesto echoed themes of psychological control and the destruction of individual autonomy. Did Murray's MK experiments create the Unabomber? The connection is more complex than simple causation, but researchers have noted that the themes Kaczynski expressed in his manifesto, autonomy, control, psychological manipulation, directly relate to what he experienced in Murray's experiments. This is one of MK's documented legacies. A CIA-funded experiment may have contributed to the creation of a domestic terrorist. The irony is bitter. A program designed to protect national security may have created a threat to it. MK has become a cultural touchstone, referenced in countless books, films, TV shows, and songs. The Manchurian Candidate was remade in 2004, with explicit MK references. The Bourne Identity film series features a protagonist who is a product of a CIA behavior modification program. Stranger Things features MK-like experiments as a central plot element. Countless thriller novels feature mind control programs based on MK. The program has become shorthand for government overreach, for the dark side of intelligence operations, for the violation of civil liberties in the name of security. MK's corruption of scientific research had lasting consequences. When universities learned that CIA money had secretly funded their research, it created a crisis of trust. How could researchers be sure their funding was legitimate? How could they know their work wouldn't be used for unethical purposes? The revelation that prestigious universities had unknowingly participated in human experimentation created a scandal that took years to resolve. New ethical guidelines were established. Institutional review boards became standard. Human subjects' protections were strengthened. The Belmont Report of 1979 laid out ethical principles for research involving human subjects, principles directly informed by the MK revelations. In this sense, MK legacy includes genuine reform. The program was so obviously unethical that it forced a reckoning with research ethics that has made science more rigorous and more humane. Within the CIA and broader intelligence community, MK became a case study in mission creep and ethical failure. How had a defensive research program spiraled into human experimentation? How had institutional checks and balances failed so completely? The Church Committee investigations led to reforms, oversight boards, reporting requirements, restrictions on domestic operations. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 created legal frameworks for intelligence activities, but trust, once broken, is hard to restore. Every time a new intelligence scandal emerges, MK is referenced. It has become the benchmark for CIA misconduct, the example that proves government agencies will abuse their power if not carefully monitored. More than 60 years after MKUltra began, fundamental questions remain. Did it work? The CIA has never admitted that any of the MKUltra techniques were operationally successful. The 1963 Inspector General report suggested most experiments had little scientific merit. But would they admit it if they had discovered effective mind control techniques? Did it ever really end? MKUltra officially ended in 1964, but successor programs like MK Search continued into the 1970s. Projects Often and Chickwit explored similar territory. How can we be sure that somewhere in the classified world, similar research isn't continuing under a different name? Are there more victims? The CIA estimated that thousands of people were subjected to unwitting drug tests. Only a handful have been identified. Are there elderly Americans who still don't know they were MKUltra subjects? Are there families who attributed psychological problems or suicides to other causes, never knowing their loved one was drugged by the government? What else don't we know? The destruction of records means we only see a fragment of MKUltra. What was in those destroyed files? What other programs existed that we've never heard of? These questions fuel ongoing suspicion of government secrecy. They're why conspiracy theories persist. They're why MKUltra casts such a long shadow. Perhaps MKUltra's most lasting legacy is the erosion of trust. The program violated the fundamental social contract that government exists to protect its citizens, not experiment on them. When citizens learn that their government drugged people without consent, that it corrupted scientific research, that it destroyed evidence to avoid accountability, that it lied for decades, trust becomes very difficult to restore. This matters because intelligence agencies require public trust to function in a democracy. They need citizens to believe that classified operations serve the national interest, not bureaucratic convenience or institutional power. MKUltra demonstrated that without oversight, without transparency, without accountability, agencies will abuse their authority. It's a lesson America learned painfully and continues to relearn with each new scandal. The program's legacy isn't just the damaged lives of its victims. It's the damaged relationship between government and citizen, the knowledge that those who claim to protect us may be the ones we need protection from. MKUltra began with fear. Fear of communist brainwashing, fear of falling behind in the Cold War, fear that America's enemies had discovered ways to control the human mind. This fear seemed to justify any action, any experiment, any violation of human dignity. But fear-driven policy led to horror. Sidney Gottlieb dosing his colleagues with LSD, Frank Olson crashing through a hotel window, prostitutes luring men into CIA safe houses where they would be drugged and watched, addicts forced to take LSD for weeks on end, mental patients used as guinea pigs, prisoners experimented on without consent, and then, when exposure seemed imminent, the destruction of evidence, the cover-up, the lies, the decades of denial, at least one confirmed death, possibly more. Thousands of people drugged without their knowledge or consent. Scores of institutions corrupted by secret CIA funding. Scientific research tainted by hidden intelligence agendas. Decades of government deception. A legacy of conspiracy theories that continue to this day. Admiral Stansfield Turner told Congress in 1977, "It is totally abhorrent to me to think of using a human being as a guinea pig and in any way jeopardizing his life and his health, no matter how great the cause." But for 11 years, from 1953 to 1964, that's exactly what the CIA did. Not reluctantly, not as a last resort, but systematically, extensively, and with institutional approval at the highest levels. Richard Helms, who ordered the destruction of MKUltra records, went on to become ambassador to Iran. He received the National Security Medal. He died in 2002, having never fully accounted for his role in the cover-up. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who ran MKUltra, retired to his farm in Virginia. He raised goats, tended his garden, and lived quietly until his death in 1999. In rare interviews, he expressed no remorse. The experiments, he said, were necessary for national security. Allen Dulles, the CIA director who approved MKUltra, was fired by President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs disaster. But he remained influential, serving on the Warren Commission that investigated Kennedy's assassination. He died in 1969, his legacy forever tied to the excesses of the early CIA. These men believed they were patriots. They believed the threat justified the means. They believed that in the shadow war of the Cold War, ethics were a luxury America couldn't afford. History has judged them differently. The question that remains: MKUltra remains one of the darkest chapters in American intelligence history. But it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. If they did this then, what could they be doing now? We know about MKUltra only because of accidents, because documents were misfiled and escaped destruction, because persistent journalists and investigators refused to accept official denials, because enough time passed that speaking about it no longer seemed dangerous. How many other programs exist in the classified world? How many operations run without oversight, justified by claims of national security hidden behind walls of secrecy? The Church Committee reforms created new oversight mechanisms. The intelligence committees of Congress are supposed to monitor the agencies. The Freedom of Information Act opens some windows into classified operations. But secrecy remains vast. The classified world is enormous, and human nature hasn't changed. The impulse to justify unethical acts in the name of security, to believe that the ends justify the means, to think this time it's different. MKUltra is not just history, it's a warning. It warns us that government agencies given secrecy and power will abuse both. It warns us that appeals to national security can justify almost any atrocity. It warns us that without transparency, without oversight, without accountability, the protectors become the threat. It warns us that "it can't happen here" is what people say right before it happens. On August 3, 1977, Senator Daniel Inouye closed the congressional hearings on MKUltra with these words: "The Select Committee on Intelligence has been working very closely with President Carter, the Vice President and Admiral Turner in developing basic concepts for statutory guidelines which will govern all activities of the intelligence agencies of the United States. Those guidelines were written, reforms were implemented, oversight was strengthened. But the fundamental tension remains. How do we keep ourselves safe in a dangerous world without becoming the danger ourselves?" MKUltra shows us what happens when we answer that question wrong. When we let fear override ethics, when we convince ourselves that our intentions justify our actions. When we decide that some people, the addicted, the imprisoned, the mentally ill, the foreign, are expendable in pursuit of national security. The program ended more than half a century ago, but its lessons remain urgent. If they did this then, what else could they be hiding today? That question echoes still unanswered in the corridors of classified power.